Hey, good evening. Funny note about the way everyone is sitting tonight. We're normally extremely out of balance on this side. But tonight, is it the sheep and the goats? I don't know how that works exactly. But tonight, this side wins. So, fun fact. The lesson. I always feel bad when you use that example and you start pointing to sides. Like one side has to be the goats when you read Matthew 25. It's just about where you sat. Anyway, the lesson tonight, we're talking about the way. When you read in the New Testament, there are several different names for Christians. Obviously, Christians would be one of the names. Most often, I would say people are referred to as brethren or brothers. Some versions might even say brothers and sisters, but the idea there is family, right? There's this family tie. When they're referenced, sometimes they'll be called, like in the book of Acts, they'll be called the believers, right? There were believers, or the disciples are these followers of Jesus. The group will often be called the disciples. Paul, we read it today in class, where he described it as the church of Christ. The church of Christ greets you in Romans chapter 16. He also, Paul, in almost all of his letters, refers to Christians as saints or the saints. There are a lot of different names, and obviously, like we said, Christians, people who follow Chris or Christ, Christians. That's always confused me, but you see what I'm saying. There are a lot of different names for these people who follow Jesus. I heard a guy recently say he is a proclaimed agnostic, but an open-minded one, and he said something to the effect of, at this point, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it's undeniable that there was a man named Jesus who lived and did something so extraordinary that shortly after his death, people started worshiping him, which is extremely rare, especially in a Jewish community. And so what did these people who shortly after Jesus' death start calling themselves? But all these different kinds of names: believers, disciples, Christians, saints. And then if you look at the lesson title, you'll know which one I'm going to talk about tonight. And it is that they called themselves the Way, or followers of the Way. And shorthand throughout the book of Acts, they commonly reference the Christians or this movement as the Way. So look at Acts chapter 9 and verse 2. We'll just pop over to a couple of these. Acts chapter 9 and verse 2 is talking from the perspective of Saul before he was a Christian, and he's talking negatively, and he refers to them as the Way. Verse 1, but Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the Way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And so that's interesting, right? He refers to any belonging to the Way. Now, one thing is, I remember hearing people were talking about biblical names for a church, and one person said the Way would be a really cool name. And it's interesting that the people here picked that name, or that became a way of referring to Christians in the New Testament, early Christians, for one reason, because it sounds the coolest, right? I mean, do you want to be believers or members of the Way? Like, that sounds very cool, right? The other thing is, they hadn't seen The Mandalorian yet, so no one was, like, that wasn't in anyone's vernacular, but I have to believe that The Mandalorian probably was referencing this. This is the Way. Anyway, so they get described as the Way, and you'll notice it's capitalized. If you have the ESV, at least, the editors have decided to capitalize that because it's this formal thing, right? The church, or the Way. That's what they're called. There's another spot in Acts 19. Look at Acts 19. In verse 9, Paul is in Ephesus, and it says, but when some became stubborn and continued in unbelief, speaking evil of the Way before the congregation, he withdrew from them and took the disciples with him, and reasoning daily in the hall of Tyrannus. Okay, again, dealing with Paul, a lot of Acts deals with Paul, and he refers to outsiders looking at them and saying the Way, right? They were talking evil about the Way. And again, it's like this entity, this group of people are referred to as the way. There's another one in Acts 24 where Paul says, I admit that I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way. So this time, he's not Saul anymore, he's Paul, and he's referring to it as an insider, a member of the church, someone in the way, saying that he follows the way. Now, listen, to us, again, unless you're preloaded with some Mandalorian background data, those are just two very, very common words. They're common words that we use to talk about, hey, how do you get somewhere? Well, this is the way. This is how you go to that place, right? Which way do we go? You go that way or this way. It's just a very normal, plain, like unoffensive, unimportant word, the way. And so it makes you wonder, why did the early Christians feel like this was how they wanted to identify themselves? Why were they identifying themselves as the way? Why is it capitalized in so many of these spots? And why did they feel like that was something that was a defining marker as who they were? Okay, well, that's what we're going to tackle because it's an interesting question. I mean, the short answer, stand and sing answer would be because it's the coolest one in the end. But unsurprisingly, there's a lot more going into that name than you might suppose, certainly than I supposed. All the way back in the story, in the Old Testament, the story of the Exodus, there is there's a story told, right, of the Exodus. It has, in our minds, one main part. When we talk about the Exodus, we even teach kids that word means going out, and we point them out to the exit sign, which is the sign to tell you where to go out. And that makes a lot of sense. The problem is that in the understanding of the authors of the Bible, that is one of a three-part unit that is the Exodus. So when we think about the Exodus, we think about God, 10 plagues, out of Egypt, Exodus. When the authors of the Bible thought about or referenced the Exodus, they thought about it as a much bigger event. That it wasn't just God bringing the people out, but it had a three-part movement, that it was bringing the people out, bringing the people through, and then bringing the people in. All right? So the out part, obviously we know this part of the story. It's one we're most familiar with. God's people are enslaved in Egypt, and then God comes to Moses in a burning bush and says, you're going to lead my people out of Egypt. And Moses, declines for a number of reasons, and God eventually just says, because I'm God, go do it. And so Moses goes, and he through God's power, does these 10 plagues. And the 10 plagues systematically, like Trevor even mentioned in his class, I think that was Wednesday, these 10 plagues systematically line up with these Egyptian gods. And they show how Yahweh, the God of Israel's power, is greater than any Egyptian god. All right? And then, after this 10th plague, Pharaoh finally relents and lets the people go. And all of Israel, all of the Hebrews, exit out of Egypt. And then they get to the Red Sea. Pharaoh has a change of heart, decides to get his army and come after them, and they're caught between a rock and a hard place, or water and army, or death and death. They're in the middle of death. And so the people are like, well, this is dumb. Why do we ever leave? And Moses prays to God. God tells him to put out his staff, and the waters part. And the Israelites, the Hebrews at that time, walk across on dry ground to the other side of the water. They go through the waters and to new life on the other side. We've talked about that image before. And then as Pharaoh and his armies follow them, the waters come crashing back down and eliminate Pharaoh's army. And the people are on the other side, and they have gone out, right? God has brought them out of the land of Egypt. But then right after that, they have these several incidents where they have to go to the mountain, to Mount Sinai. And Moses goes up the mountain, and he spends these times with God. He goes up I can't remember if it was 7 or if it was 8 different times. He goes up and down the mountain all these different times. And he talks to God on the mountain, and God gives him the law on the mountain. He gives him the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Moses writes down the law while he's up on the mountain. And then when he comes down the mountain, the people the first time the people made a golden calf and decided that that was their God. And then Moses smashes that to pieces, and I believe he grinds it into a powder and makes them drink it. And then he goes back up the mountain and gets the copy of the law again from God, and he goes back down the mountain, and the people are hungry and grumbling and complaining. And then they send these spies out, and the spies come back with a mostly bad report, all except for 2. And then God says, you guys aren't ready for the promised land. You're going to wander. This generation's going to pass away. And while they wander, they face all of these challenges. And when I say challenges, I don't mean like it was just really hard to wander in the wilderness. It was, but it's more than that. They face these tests. Now, I can't think of a better word, but when you and I think of a test, I shouldn't speak for all of you, but generally, when we think of a test, we think of someone like trying to get one over on us or trying to see where we're at. When you think of test in this context, think of it more as training, more as formation, more as I have been working at running faster, and today I'm going to take a test and see how much faster I've gotten, right? It's my test. It's not someone doing something to make you stumble or fall, but it's a process of formation, a process of training. And so while they're in the wilderness, they experience all these various tests, and they tend to fail them. I heard one teacher say that it was that getting his people out of Egypt was the easy part. It just took a handful of days or weeks. But God getting the Egypt out of his people took 40 years. That getting his people primed to be his kind of people and in the promised land and do things in that place, be the blessing to all the nations like they were supposed to. And it took a while for God to get the Egypt out of his people. So that's the road through. It's that time in the wilderness where God is testing. He's forming these people, and he's leading them through the wilderness and there's our third road, or our third way, the way into the promised land. And this, of course, doesn't happen with Moses. This ultimately ends up happening with Joshua. And what's the signifier that this is the way in, that the kicks off the way in? Interestingly, it's the same thing that kicked off the way out, the parting of a body of water. And so the Hebrews go through the Red Sea on the road through, or the way through in the wilderness, and then through the Jordan River on the way into the promised land. And when later Bible authors talk about this, or even when Moses talks about this Exodus, the Exodus, which, mind you, we've said this before, is the single most referenced action that God has done in all the Bible. When people talk about God, they talk about the God of the Exodus, the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt and into the promised land. You see, sometimes the authors of the Bible will only reference pieces of the puzzle. But this is what's going on. They're not just referencing, he brought us out and into the wilderness, but it's out, it's through, and it's into. And it has this sort of 3-part structure. If you guys remember, which I'm sure you probably don't, but we referenced this very briefly when we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah on Wednesdays forever ago. Because the structure of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which was one scroll, actually follows the same 3-part structure. You've got Ezra, who leads the people, or Zerubbabel, who leads the people out, and then you've got Ezra, who leads the people through, and then you've got Nehemiah, who leads the people in. And the main action in each of their 3 stories takes place going out, going through, and going into the promised land, which, again, is an allusion from the authors back to this story and this structure of the Exodus story. Moses, in Exodus chapter 6, writes about, and this is God telling him what to tell the people, he introduces the idea of redemption. The first time that the idea of God redeeming his people comes into the story of the Bible is in Exodus chapter 6. In verse 6, it says, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with great acts of judgment. All right, so this idea that is very important idea to our faith right now of being redeemed by Christ's blood. The very first time God redeemed people, right here in Exodus chapter 6. Also, another really important piece of our faith, salvation. The very first time God talks about being salvation to his people is also in Exodus chapter 14 and verse 13. Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again." Moses said this at the bank of the Red Sea, right before the crossing of the Red Sea. So the story of the Exodus is like the bedrock, the foundation for the story of redemption and the story of salvation. And it has this three-part structure. We're going to look at a couple other spots that emphasize this three-part structure. But what's really important to notice is this three-part structure is not just arbitrary or how the story went. It has a form to it on purpose. The first part, the road out or the way out, is about rescue. That's what God did for his people when they were in Egypt. He rescued them from Pharaoh. He redeemed and he saved them from Pharaoh. Then, while they're in the wilderness, God is doing something with them again. He's forming his people. So rescue, then in the way through, you've got formation, and then in the way into the promised land, well, what is promised in the promised land but rest? Rest of the biblical kind, not kick back and have a cold Coke on the beach with your toes in the sand kind of rest, but rest where you get to work in God's rest. You and God are together just like Adam in Genesis chapter 1, having a job, having a responsibility, having a vocation, but in the presence of God in rest. So, rescue, the way out; formation, the way through; rest, the way in to the promised land. That's the structure of the Exodus. Now, if this is what the New Testament people, the Christians in the New Testament, were referencing by calling themselves the way, it probably wouldn't be the only time we see people reference it. So we're going to look at a couple of these real quick. Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Look at Deuteronomy 8. Moses, right towards the end of his life, he gives this big speech that we call Deuteronomy. Technically, he gives 5 big speeches that we call Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy 8, here pretty early on, he references this idea throughout the whole chapter, but in Deuteronomy 8 and verse 14, he uses the phrase that's going to be one of the most common phrases to refer to God all throughout the rest of the Bible, where he says, "Then your heart will be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the wilderness, through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions, who brought you water out of the rock, out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end." So right away, Moses describes what happened as the way out. He led you up out of the land of Egypt, right? That was the rescue. He saved you from slavery. Then he uses the same language of the way through. He led you through the wilderness. And while in the wilderness, it says that he fed you, and then at the end, he says he tested you, right? That he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. So again, this isn't like a test, like a trick, like God wanting to see, are you worthy to be my people? But it's a test like training, like formation. It's God taking these people and trying to get all the Egypt out of their heart to make them the kind of people that he can use as a blessing to all the nations. And then if you back all the way up, Moses started with this one in this speech to verse 7. It says, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs flowing in the valleys and hills." And then skip down to verse 10. It says, "And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you." So again, it's this idea of being led on the way into the promised land. So you've got Moses here at the very end of the Torah outlining the way out of slavery, rescue, the way through the wilderness, the formation when God is forming and shaping his people, and the way into the promised land when people get to go into the land and rest with God. That's the picture of the Exodus according to Moses here in Deuteronomy. The story, of course, and we already mentioned, is bookended by the parting of water. Let's look at Joshua 24. Joshua is the one who judges Ruth, if you remember. Joshua 24, again, right towards the end of Joshua's book. This is on the heels of or right before the choose you this day who you will serve. And if you look at verse 17, Joshua 24 and verse 17. Well, let's back it up and get the whole sentence. Verse 16, "Then the people answered, 'Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God.'" This is, again, shorthand, right? A description of the three-part structure, right? We've got the way out of slavery, the way through the wilderness, and then the way into the promised land that God drove the people out of before their eyes. Let's look at another one. Let's go with Nehemiah. I already told you that this one is, we referenced this one when we studied Ezra and Nehemiah. However, in Nehemiah's, or in, I think it's Nehemiah's prayer in Nehemiah chapter 9. Excuse me. Yeah, in Nehemiah chapter 9, during Nehemiah's prayer, he references all three pieces of this: the way out, the way through, and the way in this one chapter, in Nehemiah chapter 9. Let's start in verse 9. 9, and we'll read just the next couple verses. Nehemiah is, at this point, confessing the sin on behalf of the people of Israel, and he says, "And you saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt, and heard their cry at the Red Sea, and performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of this land. For you knew that they acted arrogantly against our fathers, and you made a name for yourself, as it is to this day. And you divided the sea from before them, so that they went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and you cast their pursuers into the depths, as a stone into mighty waters." All right, so what's he describing here? Again, not using the language, but he's telling the story, the way out. You delivered your people out of Egypt. So then we should expect to see next the way through, and we certainly do. Look at verse 12. "By a pillar of cloud you led them in the day, and by a pillar of fire in the night, to light for them a way in which they should go. You came down on Mount Sinai, you spoke with them from heaven and gave them right rules and true laws, good statutes and commandments. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath and commanded them commandments and statutes by the law, and a law by Moses your servant. You gave them bread from heaven for their hunger and brought water for them out of the rock for their thirst. And you told them to go in and possess the land that you had sworn to give them." All right, so there we go. He describes, again, not saying through, but he describes the time in the wilderness and how God provided for his people through the wilderness. And then we should see the way in here in the last section. And of course we do. It's the way Nehemiah structured his prayer, this three-part Exodus that he's referencing. Let's pick back up in verse 19. "You, in your great mercies, did not forsake them in the wilderness. You didn't leave them there. The pillar of cloud to lead them in the way did not depart from them by day, nor the pillar of fire by night to light for them the way which they should go. You gave your good spirit to instruct them and did not withhold your manna from their mouths and gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. And you gave them kingdoms and peoples and allotted to them every corner. So they took possession of the land of Sihon and king of Heshbon, and the land of Og, king of Bashan. You multiplied their children as the stars of heaven. There's another reference. And you brought them into the land that you had told their fathers to enter and possess. All right, so again, he's telling the story of the Exodus, and he fills it with this three-part structure. The way out of Egypt, out of slavery, the way through the wilderness in the time of formation, and the way into the promised land that God had promised. We're looking at all of these, and I can do a lot more. The truth of the matter is, when you see the pattern, it's like everywhere. It's like in almost every story. What you're going to notice as you see this pattern come up is that sometimes the authors will reference the Exodus as the thing that God did, and they'll just shorthand reference it as the God who brought us out of the land of Egypt. You're supposed to fill in the rest of that. Or maybe, in some cases, the author is only emphasizing the rescue on purpose. Other times, it'll be about the God who led us into the promised land. Again, referencing the Exodus with this three-part structure, but emphasizing just a certain part of it. The prophets do this several different times. Isaiah in chapter 11. Let's read this one. Look at Isaiah 11. Look at Isaiah 11. Let's go to verse 15. Isaiah 11 and verse 15. Let's back up. Verse 14, sorry. Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 14. Again, he's only going to reference a piece of it, but then with the picture, he paints the same idea of this three-part Exodus. In verse 14, he says, "But they shall swoop down on the shoulder of the Philistines in the west, and together they shall plunder the people of the east, and they shall put out their hand against Edom and Moab, and the Ammonites shall obey them. And the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and will wave his hand over the river with his scorching breath, and strike it into 7 channels, and he will lead the people across in sandals. And there will be a highway away from Assyria for the people that remains of his people, for the remnant that remains of his people, as there was for Israel when they came up from the land of Egypt." So a couple things he's doing here to bring up that imagery of the way out, the way through, and the way in. The first one, in verse 16, there will be a highway from Assyria. That word highway is the same word for the way. When you use the word the way, or in Acts, when they refer to themselves as the way, it could also be translated the highway. It just means the road, okay? The road or the way. So that word is highlighting what we're talking about. And then the picture in verse 15, that the God will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and he will wave his hand over the river with his scorching breath. So, again, they're thinking in pictures. But the picture here is that God is going to wave his hand, or he's going to destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt. Where did the way out start? Well, at that monumentous occasion, the way out was the crossing of the Red Sea. That was when their enemies were destroyed and they were freed. Okay, the Sea of Egypt. And then he'll wave his hand over the river. Where was that second body of water crossing? Well, it wasn't a sea, it was the Jordan River. They crossed through the Jordan River to go into the promised land. And so he's painting, Isaiah here is painting a picture, and then he says at the end that the people will cross in sandals. The implication? Dry ground. They're going to be able to walk right across. They're not going to have to swim. They're not going to have to gird they're just going to walk across in their sandals. God is going to, in Isaiah's understanding, lead some kind of new exodus, right? Some kind of new rescue from slavery, formation in the wilderness, and entering into a promised land. That's what he's envisioning and what he's telling the people and what they should be waiting for. So there's other spots that reference this. We're just not going to look at all of them because I think you can see clearly at this point that the authors of the Bible all felt as though Exodus had this three-part structure to it. That God's deliverance, that his redemption, and that his salvation, the origin story of God's redemption and salvation happened at the Exodus, and that the Exodus had a three-part structure to it. The way out of slavery, the way through formation, and the way into rest or the promised land. So that brings us all the way back to our question at the beginning, which is, why in the world did the early Christians decide to refer to themselves as the way? Well, I think you see it now, right? The early Christians believed and saw themselves as just the latest installment of God and his people. The early Christians said, we are Exodus people. No, we weren't there in Egypt. No, we weren't there at Sinai. No, we didn't cross through the Red Sea or the Jordan River exactly. But what did these early Christians do? Well, they were enslaved to sin, and then Jesus rescued them from their sins. And then they're being led through the wilderness and tested and formed and shaped, and we get to watch that happen real time in the letters to the churches in the New Testament. Paul constantly trying to, as we've said a million times, transform the people, not inform the people with his letters. And then there's this hope that this pattern brings to these early Christians in Acts. There's this hope that someday, he's coming back, and we get to go rest with God. Paradise, promised land. So when the people, the early Christians, the first century Christians, referred to themselves as the way, they're saying we're the people, we're Exodus people. We're the people who God is doing for now what he did back then. He's still doing it. We're just the latest edition of God rescuing and forming and bringing into the promised land. It gave them an identity. It gave them a mindset and a perspective. And I think that's the lesson for us right now. This way that the early Christians saw themselves, I mean, obviously, I think it's right. I think it is. I think they are the Exodus people. But what does that mean for us? It means we're the Exodus people. Just like the early Christians, we are standing downstream of generations of people that God has partnered with to help rescue this world and save souls and bring people close to him. We're just the latest iteration. When you adopt this mindset of the way, you have a whole new identity. You are the Exodus people. It's like you were there at the Exodus. You had your own Exodus where you passed through the waters and came into freedom. And now, here's the other part. I think this applies to us. Now you're in the wilderness. We, all of us, are currently in the wilderness, being formed and being shaped. Not only does this perspective of the way give us an identity, or the mindset of the way gives us an identity, but it gives us a perspective on what we're enduring right now. Does anybody remember suicides? Like when you had to run in high school, line drills. Do you remember this? Yeah, and you would go free throw line back, half court back, free throw line back, full court back, and as the name suggests, they were the worst. You remember this? Okay, well, if you never had to run those, bless you. And if you did, also bless you. Maybe even a little more, you need it. I remember one day my mind shifted, way after I was in any kind of organized sports, but one day my mind shifted, and I realized that the reason the best player on the team was always the one to finish first at line drills was because they had a different perspective than the rest of us. This was my perspective, all of my organized sports career. Punishment. Running is punishment. Do as little of it as you can because it's the worst and it's punishment. But here's what Marcus Smart's perspective was. He's a guy I went to high school with, played basketball with, and now he's in the pros. His perspective was betterment, right? I looked at suicides, they were punishment. He looked at them and he said, that's betterment. That's a test. Am I still the fastest? Can I run the longest? Can I take what this is and let it be a test for me to make me better? Okay, I tell you that to tell you, in the wilderness, what was happening to God's people? If we are of the way, if we're people who are following the way, followers of the way, and we're on that road through right now, if that's where we are, then what was happening to God's people in the wilderness? Formation, testing, challenges. A lot of times we look at our challenges and we say, like I did, punishment. Why is this happening to me, God? But this mindset of the way changes that. It's not punishment. It's betterment. I don't remember what I said about Marcus earlier, but it's something that's meant to form you and shape you and make you better. So listen, the early Christians picked the coolest name there was, right? Not just because it sounds cool. Listen, if we put on our sign The Way at Flower Mound, immediately we'd be getting a different crowd of visitors. You know what I'm saying? Like it would be, because it's a cool name, all right? I'm not arguing that we need to do that, but I am arguing that we need to adopt the mindset of the Christians in the first century, that they are followers of the way, that they are Exodus people because we are Exodus people. And when we adopt that mindset of followers of the way, Exodus people, the latest iteration of God working with his people, man, it gives us an identity. It gives us a sense of belonging. I am not alone. We are not alone doing this right now. We are doing this the same way that our fathers did this, the same way that their fathers did this, the same way that Moses and the people that walked out of Egypt that day and through the promised land and into through the wilderness and into the promised land, we're doing the same thing they did. But we get to follow Jesus instead of Moses. And that makes us the most blessed people in the whole world. It's an identity. The Exodus people. And it also gives us a perspective that can change some of our suffering and turn it into testing or challenging or forming to be the kind of people that God wants us to be so that we can enter into that rest with God forever. We get to be with God for eternity because we're Exodus people and we're on the way. Right now we're on the way through, but someday we get to go on the way in. And that's what we hope for. And we have hope. It's the third thing it gives you, not just perspective on your suffering, but hope for the future. It gives you identity, it gives you perspective on your suffering, and it gives you hope for the future with God forever. Man, let's be Exodus people. Let's be followers of the way. Tonight, if you need prayers of the church, or if you need to get on the way, that road, that highway that leads you out through and into the promised land, let us know. We'll be happy to pray with you, help you, study with you, whatever you need, if you'll come while we stand and sing.